Hey guys, my name is Mike Lacasco, and this will be my video presentation for the Computer Science 4733 assignment. The idea behind this presentation tonight is to table the ethical question of what the relationship between an individual and a company should be, and what rights should we have over things like our personal data when we opt in to use a company's products or services. Additionally, I want to discuss the idea of consent and what it means to me. To do this, I will provide some historical context and also discuss what the EU is doing to address this very thing. To close this presentation, I will discuss why I feel like I should have a say in what big companies do with my data. So what rights are we giving away to these mega companies? If we buy something on Amazon, should our shipping address be sold to third-party companies with no regulations? In terms of lawfulness, how many of us have actually read the terms and conditions we are so quick to accept and know what you're signing up for when updating an app or signing up for Apple, Twitter, or Facebook? I know I don't. And while I very easily could, the truth is that companies are not transparent, and they use the terms and conditions as a loophole by purposefully burying the stuff in legal jargon somewhere on page 36 where no one will ever look. Before giving this presentation, I actually tried to find this information on Apple's terms and conditions before updating the iOS on my phone. I didn't have a clue where to look, nor could I make sense of the majority of it. And like I said, this is done deliberately by companies because they know people like me aren't going to read them. In Facebook's terms and conditions, for example, you are agreeing to grant Facebook a non-exclusive, transferable, sub-licensable, royal-free worldwide license to any IP content that you post on or in connection with Facebook. This means that Facebook is free to use your photos pretty much how they'd like anywhere in the world without paying you a penny or asking your permission. This also means that Facebook can either transfer the license to another entity or just sub-license it, again, without your permission. Now, for me to consume the convenience of these platforms like Facebook, I must be willing to give some things up and waive some rights. In truth, this is really the only way these platforms can be offered for free. The fact is that we in the US regarding data privacy is not new, nor is it a modern day dilemma. There is actually quite a bit of historical context. Let me try to explain and relate it to modern times. So the idea that I need to give something up in order to gain something to benefit me is included in a set of political theories known as social contract theory. One of the most famous social contract theorists is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This guy was around from 1712 to 1778, and his political philosophy and writings really influenced the progress of the Enlightenment period throughout Europe. In a nutshell, his idea was that we all originally exist in a state of nature as feral human beings who are really just focused on survival and not really doing anything with their lives. His belief was that we should all come together in order to create an agreement how we can live so that we can be less concerned with survival and pursue better things. To accomplish this, a contract would be drawn up to set out the rules by which we could all coexist, and all would agree to it. Rousseau believed that when people are all getting along harmoniously and taking care of each other's basic needs, like food and water, they would be able to do other things like talk about philosophy and ethics, and eventually become more rational people. For Rousseau, the aim was to reach a state of reason. Rousseau believed that as a part of a state, you are actually freer than being on your own. This was because when you are part of a state, you have more freedom to pursue higher order of things and to think about philosophy. So for Rousseau, it was not the state itself that was a good thing, it was what you were able to do as part of that state that makes it good. For the time, this was very revolutionary thinking because what Rousseau is saying is that individuals within a state have the freedom and responsibility to go off and pursue higher order things instead of just being blind followers of what the hierarchy said they ought to be. In Rousseau's social contract theory book, he puts this idea into context by stating that man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. What I want to get across with this example is just how disruptive Rousseau was with these theories. What he is saying is that the power lies with the people and that when they act as a body, they are the ones who are in charge. What the people do is put a government in place to act out the will of these people day to day. So in a time when we had kings in charge telling the people what they should do, Rousseau is saying, no, That's not how it should be. He's actually saying the people are in charge, and you, king, is on your throne because we put you on your throne. Now, how the heck does this have anything to do with computer ethics and, more importantly, my topic? I want you to think about a state as this amazing new creation and how it allows us to move from savagery to rationality and become better and more developed people. In a similar way, it's society that created the internet, which in itself is a mechanism that allowed society to move from a very analog way of working to a very digitally connected and globalized way of working, and has also arguably allowed us to move into the next stages of human development. In this kind of model, we have this state which has the people inside who are independent and who create a government to control and organize it. The parallel would be how this internet world exists, and we are the sovereigns or the users within it, and the companies are the internet service providers like the Googles, the Twitters, and Facebooks. They are comparative to the governments. Now, if the sovereign or free people in Rousseau's theory can be compared to the user of the internet, we the people should be able to do something if we are not happy about what's going on. I do believe there is a parallel here, and it lies in understanding how can we use Rousseau's theory to realize how we can respond to this power that we have placed in charge of ourselves. To answer this, I will move on to another social contract theorist named John Locke. What Locke does is add something new to the social contract dialogue that had been going on before him. He introduces the idea of consent to the social contract. He says that for a government to be legitimate and be acting on behalf of the sovereign or the people, you have to give your consent to that government through things like an election. Locke goes so far as to say that you can only really fully be a member of society when you vote and give that consent, but he also acknowledges that not everyone can or will vote. In such a case, Locke believes that you can still give your consent in what's called tacit consent. All tacit consent means is that someone can still give their consent by refraining from things like contradiction or objection. In a case where you may not be voting for a government, you are giving tacit consent or approval by being a law-abiding member of society. Locke goes on to say that if the elected government is one you cannot legitimize or give any consent to, move out. Like those who may not agree with the current political situation or who may have voted for Hillary, Locke says we can either accept the outcome and try to change it the next time around, or leave and go somewhere else if you don't like it. Now let's fold this back in on this idea of the internet being the new state and the companies and corporations being the government and governance within that state. While we don't elect the CEOs of the Googles and Twitters, we can still refuse to give our consent to these companies by just not using their platforms. While I can choose to not use Google or choose not to use Amazon, I can also choose to use their competitors if their values align more closely with mine, and if enough people were to do this, the companies we don't like would go bankrupt. What this means to me is that anytime I am on the internet or one of these platforms, I am actually giving tacit consent because I'm making use of the service. Now, if I want to take back my consent, I have two options to opt out of this so-called internet state. First, I could choose to make my way over to the dark web or take myself back to a time when people lived without internet. In reality, neither of those are very practical. If I were to withdraw myself from the internet completely, it would be nearly impossible to live. For example, my company uses the internet to pay me. How would I get that paycheck transferred to my bank? With only these two options, it's pretty easy to see that there really isn't anywhere for us to go and also live a connected digital life where I'm either not ruled by one of these companies or I'm not unsafe on the dark web or disconnected from everything. That means I'm pretty much screwed no matter how you look at it. Now, on a happy note, let's discuss how these ethical theories can actually be applied in real-world examples. For example, I can think of in the real world is by looking at Facebook ads. Facebook uses our data from social media profiles and our interactions on the internet to target advertisements at us. So I'm sure you have all been on any given web page and one of these ads will pop up based on your browsing history or your purchase history. I experienced this also tonight while working on this presentation when I paused to purchase Breaking Bad Season 1 for a family member's birthday present. Now, when I sign into Facebook, I constantly see ads for Breaking Bad Season 2. I personally find this annoying. However, I know that Facebook is really just an advertising company that exists to gather data and in return gives me a useful service. I have also opted into this and given both explicit content by signing their terms and conditions and tacit consent by continuing to use it. So even though this does annoy me, it clearly doesn't annoy me enough to move on, and I continue to use these products with the knowledge of what it is. For those of you who feel like you can relate, I want to ask you if you really opted into using Facebook this way. While I admit that I must have clicked somewhere to agree with their terms and conditions contract, I will say that I never explicitly opted into having those rights of privacy taken away from me. I'm sure I'm not unique in this situation, and like I said before, these companies purposefully make it difficult for us to understand. If they did want us to read it, it would be clearly stated in big font and, more importantly, in language we can understand without needing an advanced law degree. Now, across the ocean, the EU has looked at this problem more closely and actually took action. A new piece of legislation was put in place in May 2018 called the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. And this is a piece of EU legislation which changes the way that data is gathered, used, and shared. What the GDPR says is that instead of companies being able to use your information in any way they choose, they are going to require you to explicitly sign up to their data procedures. So as in the past where you would sign up for Google or get an app and be forced to agree with how they share their data with third parties and tacitly agree to how they process it and sell it to third-party companies for like Facebook ads, this new law is changing the way that consent is required. No longer will tacit consent be enough by just signing the terms and conditions and agreeing to everything. Moving forward, explicit consent will be required, and you will have to say what you're okay with companies doing with your information. More than that, these companies now have to be really transparent with how they are going to use your information. So no longer can terms and conditions say something like, we may share this information with third-party providers. Instead, the terms and conditions will say who they are going to share it with and when and what the conditions for doing so will be. Looking at this from Locke's perspective, we were being asked to do this like mandatory voting. So now at any point where we may be giving away some of our rights to achieve a privilege or to be a part of the internet state, we now have to explicitly understand what that is, and I have no doubt that this is the right thing to do in today's circumstances. To summarize my argument, I would personally much rather be burdened by the act of having to define how I want to be contacted and when and who I want to share my data with, rather than just scrolling to the very bottom of a terms and conditions page the next time I update my iTunes or iPhone. I personally agree with the EU in their stance that the people are now dealing with very powerful companies and that citizens have been giving away their rights. In addition to protecting an individual's rights, the GDPR highly regulates what organizations should and shouldn't do to comply and what happens to them if they don't meet these new standards. I think this is also a very important piece of protecting our data. One of the key components of this are the fines. Money is a great motivator to do the right things, and these fines can be 4% of a company's total revenue or 20 million euros, which equates to about 22 million US dollars. This means that now enforcement action can be taken against the data processors, which are the companies who control shared data, and that the Facebooks and Yahoos and Equifaxes would have been subject to heavy fines for their most recent breaches. So while the GDPR focuses on the protection of individuals, it places the workloads inside companies and organizations who are responsible for managing the data of those individuals. My opinion is that the US is long overdue for an update to their data protection laws, and that the data laws in the US are completely inadequate by comparison to the GDPR. In the same way that I have a right to a fair trial and a right to privacy, I feel the right to have my information accessed by only people I want accessing my data is a human right, and I should have control in the matter. No longer should companies be able to share data that they have been given unless they have also been given explicit consent to do it in terms that are easily understood and transparent to the individual.